Welcome to the Books of Titans podcast, where I seek truth in the world's great books. I'm your host, Erik Rostad, coming to you from the beautiful Books of Titans studio in Franklin, Tennessee. My goal is to read 200 of the great books over the next 10 years and share what I'm learning. I'll talk a bit about each book, tie ideas together from a variety of genres, and share the one thing I always hope to remember from each of the great books. Well, in last week's episode, I had a lot of fun by pairing two books together, and I'm going to do the same thing in this episode. I'm going to pair two books together. The first is In Praise of Good Bookstores by Jeff Deutsch, and the second is On Writing and Writers by C.S. Lewis. It's a collection of statements by C.S. Lewis. So it's called On Writing and Writers, a Miscellany of Advice and Opinions. These are books 24 and 25 from my 2023 reading list. Well, it is July, and that means I am on a month where I'm taking a break of sorts. So this year I started reading through the great books, but each July and December I'm giving myself a month where I just take a break, kind of maintain my sanity and read through some of the books that start to pile up on that to be read list. So these were two of the books, and it was just kind of neat that they were back to back because they're somewhat related. So I'll get into how they're related, just in the sense of one's about bookstores and the other's about writing and authors, advice to authors, and that kind of thing. So it hits kind of two sides of that coin, and so it made for a good back to back. So I'm going to start off with In Praise of Good Bookstores and discussing some of the things I enjoyed about that. In segment 2, I'll cover the C.S. Lewis one, and then in segment 3, I'll kind of tie them together in a way. So for In Praise of Good Bookstores, I'd like to start by proposing that we start doing something going forward. This is you, dear readers, that we start doing something. And it is this, that we start kissing our books upon completing them. And why would I say such a ridiculous thing? Well, let me just read from page 10 and 11 here. These books were read. Books are for use, after all, and were treated with reverence and love. Observant Jews are accustomed to kissing the cover of a book after closing it, a habit that has remained with me throughout the years, end quote. That's the author speaking, but I say we take that on as well. So are you with me? Let's, once we start finishing books, let's just pick it up, grab the front cover, give it a little kiss. I love that idea. Just kind of the honor and respect for it of the books that we're reading. I think it's a cool idea. Another cool idea in this book was to think of a bookshelf as a garden. And here Jeff Deutsch is quoting Ibn Tibbon, which is a fantastic name. And this Ibn Tibbon says this: "Let your bookcases and your shelves be your gardens and your pleasure grounds. Pluck the fruit that grows therein, gather the roses, the spices, and the myrrh." End quote. That's beautiful. This was perhaps my favorite part of the entire book, and this is a distinction between browsing and getting recommendations based upon an algorithm. So let me just read this paragraph here. While an algorithm might suggest a book that we are likely to enjoy based upon who we've been, or what an advertiser might want us to think we want, nothing can replace the work of browsing to help us discover who we are or who we might become. End quote. I love that distinction, and I don't think I've ever thought about it in that sense. When we're confronted with you might like this based upon what you've liked, that is pointing to the past. That's pointing to what we've liked in the past. That's who we were. Whereas browsing in a bookstore can help us to discover who we are or who we might become. We're confronted with other books that we may not have heard of, maybe other ideas. And so that's moving in an opposite direction. That's moving forward, whereas an algorithm can only tell you what you might like based upon what you've liked by looking into the past. I thought that was a fantastic idea and something I'll come back to in segment 3 of this episode here. Last thing for this section that I'm kind of titling good, cool things for readers. The last comes here, and I'm going to read this. This is page 75 and 76, and is about private libraries. Calvino, in considering the importance of books of all times, urges the reader to invent their own ideal library of classics, composed half of books that we have read and that have really counted for us, and half of books we propose to read and will presume to come to count, leaving a section of empty shelves for surprises and occasional discoveries. Jose Gaius Ortega y Gasset's student said that every private library is a reading plan. Every private library is a reading plan. Susan Sontag, another seminary co-op member, called her library an archive of longings. End quote. So Jeff Deutsch is he works at the seminary co-op in Chicago. And so he talks a lot about that bookstore in this book, but the book is really just an ode and a love story, a love note to bookstores. Contains a number of quotes throughout, and really great quotes, but just talks about the experience of going to bookstores and what that means. So the first part there, I highlighted things that are for readers. This next part here, I'm going to highlight things that are really about bookstores. And if you don't know, I work at Landmark Booksellers in Franklin, Tennessee. I'm the business manager there. And one of the so I try to read books about bookstores and books like this every now and then. And so that's one of the reasons I picked this one up. But I got a lot out of this. I got a lot of food for thought. And actually we just purchased 6 copies of this book to share with some of the staff members. And then we're going to kind of do a book study on this book and just talk through some of these ideas. So here is a section of things that I enjoyed talking about bookstores. Good bookstores reflect their communities. Exceptional bookstores both reflect and create their communities. I loved that distinction, just a bookstores reflecting community, but exceptional ones reflecting and creating communities. Just that idea of it being a place in the community and something that can impact the community. Next up, bookstore can give you permission to be among books outside of an institution of learning. That is a really cool idea and something I hadn't considered before. So I guess when I was in college, yes, a bookstore, or not a bookstore, but just the library, it was it was common. It was right in the center of campus. I would go there quite a bit to study, just to have a quiet place to study. And so you're around books. You're assigned books to read for class. And when you graduate, that can in some ways go away. And I think, one of the tragic things nowadays is that the libraries in some of these places are going away as well, and they're digitizing and that sort of thing. But what's neat about this idea of a bookstore is that a bookstore can give you permission to be amongst books outside of an institution of learning. So it just kind of brings that back, brings that longing back. Next up, the primary product of a bookstore is not the books, it's the browsing experience. So here's the quote: "The good bookstore sells books, but its primary product, if you will, is the browsing experience." End quote. So Jeff Deutsch in this book talks a lot about creating an atmosphere of discovery, and they were very specific in how they designed the layout of their store to almost encourage people to get lost, for it not to really make sense of I can go down here and then take a left and then I know where all the books are, but it almost like secret passages in a way of just encouraging that discovery aspect. Next up, the economic model of bookstores failed us, not we it. While bookstores are no longer the most efficient or perhaps cost-effective method of procuring specific books, the selling of books has always been one of the least interesting services that bookstores provide. End quote. Again, I like that idea. I mean, it's obvious, and it's obvious when I'm at Landmark and people are taking photos of books. I know they're going to get it somewhere that's cheaper, and that's how it is. Bookstores nowadays are not going to be the most efficient. Jeff Deutsch talks a lot about this in this book about Amazon, where their books are a loss leader. They're selling those below cost to try to get you to buy other things. So it's, in a sense, it's devalued the book itself, but where a bookstore really has the advantage is being in that service of allowing you to browse. Next up, there's a number, he highlights a number of different ways to categorize books, and this one really stuck out. This is Finney Books in Seattle, and they have a total of 2 categories for all the books in their store. They have made up and true. And so at Landmark Booksellers here, we have all these different sections, tons of different categories. This Finney Books in Seattle has 2 categories, made up and true. And it's just kind of fun to think about that. Even I'm sure some books are hard to even put within that. Is this a made-up book or is this a true book? So there's just kind of a fun thought experiment there. I want to close out with just 3 different quotes that I thought were cool from this book. And the first is this: this man has now become my hero. And so I want you to listen to this man who is now my hero. In his history of reading, Alberto Manguel, an exemplary reader and supremely bookish writer, tells of Abdul Qasim Ismail, the 10th century Grand Vizier of Persia, and his 400 camels that carried his collection of 117,000 books when he traveled. Through a dexterous feat of herd indexing, he trained the camels to walk in alphabetical order, lest his collection succumb to the tyrant of chance. End quote. 400 camels carrying 117,000 books in alphabetical order. That's pretty cool. So that man, that's just amazing to think about. You think of all those books, and he could have kept them at home, but no, he wanted to travel with them. So very, very cool. Next up, the importance of time. I have covered this on past episodes. This comes up all the time in books, and wanted to share just how it comes up in this one. Seneca, in his first letter to Lucilius, explains how precious time is, imploring him to hold it in his grasp and make the most use of it. You will not die at once, he says. You are dying every day. Use your time wisely, for nothing is ours except time. And yet time is the one loan which even a grateful recipient cannot repay. So a good reminder, again, that shows up in so many different books that I read, the importance of time, how it's the most non-renewable resource, even more so than money. And the final thing here, why are we reading, asks Annie Dillard, and here is her response. If not in the hope of beauty laid bare, life heightened, and its deepest mysteries probed. Why are we reading, if not in hope that the writer will magnify and dramatize our days, will illuminate and inspire us with wisdom, courage, and the possibility of meaningfulness, and will press upon our minds the deepest mysteries so that we may feel again the majesty and power. End quote. Well said, Annie Dillard. Close out this section here just with reading stats, just so you know how long it might take you to read this same book. It's 167 pages. Took me 3 hours and 31 minutes to read. That was over 3 days, 56 pages per day, and that was July 6th through 8. Next up on Writing and Writers by C.S. Lewis. Well, speaking of Landmark Booksellers, we have both of these books in stock, and you can order them from us. We can ship anywhere in the United States, anywhere in the world, really, and that's the best way that you can support this podcast. So if you go to the show notes, I will link to these 2 books in the show notes. Well, every now and then I think to myself, you know what? Maybe C.S. Lewis is not my favorite author. I've said for a long time he's my favorite author. I started reading him. He's actually one of the very first authors I ever remember reading. My parents got me that Narnia set when I was a kid, and those are some of the first books I ever remember handling. I don't think I ever made it through any of the books when I was that young of an age, but I do remember carrying them and taking them to school and reading little bits at school and that sort of thing. And then in college, really having starting to dig deep into Lewis's works. And so for a long time, I've said that Lewis is my favorite author, but then I've read other things and I'm thinking, is he really? There's so much else out there. Maybe someone else has that place now. But then I read books like this and I'm reminded of how how and why he holds that place in my life. And I would say he still holds that place as my favorite author. So the way this book is divided is into, there's three kind of main topic areas. And one is C.S. Lewis's writing process. So it's a collection of his essays, things he wrote in letters, and other things where he's just writing about these things. So the first is his own writing process, and then tips that he's given to other writers, and then some comments on specific authors and specific works. So that's how I'm going to have this segment flow, is in those three areas. And then at the very end, I just want to read a few quotes. So the quotes I'm going to read here are a little longer. I'll try to put in a little commentary in between, but these are so rich, and there's so much gold here that I just want to read through them. So the first two quotes that I'm going to read are about C.S. Lewis's writing process. So here he says, "Some people seem to think that I began by asking myself, how could I say something about Christianity to children, then fixed on the fairy tale as an instrument, then collected information about child psychology and decided what age group I'd write for, then drew up a list of basic Christian truths and hammered out allegories to embody them. This is all pure moonshine. I couldn't write in that way at all. Everything began with images. A fawn carrying an umbrella, a queen on a sledge, a magnificent lion. At first, there wasn't even anything Christian about them. That element pushed itself in of its own accord." I thought that was so cool. And this is one of my main takeaways from this book, is just that Lewis started out with images. He didn't just sit down to write. He had images, and these spanned years, as we'll find out in the next quote here. But that's how he started, and then he would just piece together these images that he'd been carrying around in his head. So let me read this next one here. "One thing I'm sure of, all my 7 Narnian books and my 3 science fiction books began with seeing pictures in my head. At first they were not a story, just pictures. The Lion all began with a picture of a fawn carrying an umbrella and parcels in a snowy wood. This picture had been in my mind since I was about 16. Then one day when I was about 40, I said to myself, let's try to make a story about it. At first I had very little how the story would go, but then suddenly Aslan came bounding into it. I think I'd been having a good many dreams of lions about that time. Apart from that, I don't know where the lion came from or why he came. But once he was there, he pulled the whole story together, and soon he pulled the 6 other Narnian stories in after him. So you see, in a sense, I know very little about how this story was born. That is, I don't know where the pictures came from. And I don't believe anyone knows exactly how he makes things up. Making up is a very mysterious thing. When you have an idea, could you tell anyone exactly how you thought of it?" End quote. I love that. That's just wonderful. Now on to tips for writing. And in one of these letters, he gives a number of tips, 8 in total, but I want to read the first 3 because I thought they were awesome. First one, turn off the radio. Second one, read all the good books you can and avoid nearly all magazines. And then 3, always write and read with the ear, not with the eye. He goes on to say later about the ear versus the eye, mouth poetry while you read it. He said this, a habit, since lost, he had was of not smoking his pipe while reading a poem. And that was so that he could mouth the words. And he just says, and so that's on the reading side, but on the writing side as well, write with the ear, not with the eye. I thought that was cool. And I just loved that little tidbit that he had in parentheses, saying that he had this habit of not smoking while reading a poem, but he had since lost that habit. That's so funny to me that he had this habit so he could mouth the words, but the pipe actually won in the end. And he would rather have the pipe in his mouth than to mouth the words of poetry while reading them. That's just so awesome. Next up, let me read this. One of the first things we have to say to a beginner, and again, this is things he's writing to writers. One of the things we have to say to a beginner who has brought us his manuscript is avoid all epithets which are merely emotional. It is no use telling us that something was mysterious or loathsome or awe-inspiring or voluptuous. Do you think your readers will believe you just because you say so? You must go quite a different way to work. By direct description, by metaphor and simile, by secretly evoking powerful associations, by offering the right stimuli to our nerves in the right degree and the right order, and by the very beat and vowel melody and length and brevity of your sentences, you must bring it about that we readers, not you, exclaim, "How mysterious," or "loathsome," or whatever it is. Let me taste for myself, and you'll have no need to tell me how I should react to the flavor. End quote. I love that advice. Don't tell me that something is awe-inspiring or voluptuous or mysterious. Describe it in such a way that I come to that conclusion. Fantastic advice. Next up, this is page 38, and this is the connection between writing and thinking. I don't know what I mean till I see what I've said. In other words, writing and thinking were a single process. End quote. Next up, I've come to the conviction that if you cannot translate your thoughts into uneducated language, then your thoughts were confused. Power to translate is the test of having really understood one's own meaning. End quote. Those two quotes really tie together, but just that idea of writing being a way of thinking. And in fact, if you can't write it out in a way that's in uneducated language, as he said, or something maybe a 5-year-old could understand, then do you really understand it at all? Next up, this is excellent, and I'm going to read a good chunk of this section. This talks about writing in the sense of propaganda of a sort versus in encountering. So rather because I feel sure that the question, what do modern children need, will not lead you to a good moral. If we ask that question, we are assuming too superior an attitude. It would be better to ask, what moral do I need? For I think we can be sure that what does not concern us deeply will not deeply interest our readers, whatever their age. But it is better not to ask the question at all. Let the pictures tell you their own moral. For the moral inherent in them will rise from whatever spiritual roots you have succeeded in striking during the whole course of your life. But if they don't show you any moral, don't put one in. For the moral you put in is likely to be a platitude or even a falsehood. The only moral that is of any value is that which arises inevitably from the whole cast of the author's mind. End quote. I love that. I think in the sense of if you are trying to insert something into a story, if you're not just letting it grow naturally, if you're trying to insert something to, as he said, put in what modern children need, it's going to be propaganda. You're writing a piece of propaganda. You're not writing a story. I love how he just says it of if there is no moral, don't put one in. But the moral inherent in them will arise from whatever spiritual roots you have succeeded in striking during the whole course of your life. So the moral should not be something that you put in the sense of unnaturally putting something in, really for the purpose of propaganda. It should arise out of the story itself, and that's going to be from deep in the roots of your life. I loved that idea. It's something I think about a lot, and just the way he writes about it is just incredible. Now, here are some things he said about specific authors. The first is George MacDonald. He says, I know of nothing that gives me such a feeling of spiritual healing, of being washed, as to read G. MacDonald, end quote. I've thought and felt the same when reading MacDonald as well. So that was a perfect way of saying that. Next up, he compares Animal Farm to 1984, and this is pretty neat. What puzzles me is the marked preference of the public for 1984, for it seems to me, apart from its magnificent and fortunately detachable appendix on Newspeak, to be merely a flawed, interesting book. But The Farm, so Animal Farm, is a work of genius which will well outlive the particulars and, let us hope, temporary conditions that provoked it. End quote. He just goes on for a few pages here of just talking about how much better Animal Farm was than 1984. And Lewis really considered Animal Farm just to be a pure classic, one where you would not be able to put in or take away even a word. Like it was just perfect. He has some just incredible things to say about Tolkien. both about The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings. So here is one thing that I thought was really cool. The value of the myth is that it takes all the things we know and restores to them the rich significance which has been hidden by the veil of familiarity. End quote. So just talking about Tolkien's use of myth and how that can sidestep a lot of the barriers we may have. So if we're reading a piece that is in reality, as opposed to reading a myth or something like The Lord of the Rings, The Lord of the Rings might actually get past a lot of the gates that we have up and go past that veil of familiarity, as Lewis calls it. But you've got to read the things that he says about Tolkien's works. And it's so funny to read it too, because he's like, I really think, The Hobbit, I really think this is going to be a classic. And he was clearly right about that. And he says about the Lord of the Rings as well. And actually, I think he's just talking about the first book of the series, which would contain the first two parts of Lord of the Rings, but he's just talking about that, and he's already saying, this is going to be a classic. Now on to Walt Whitman. He says, I cannot bear Walt Whitman. So it was funny. He was, he would be quite honest of his feelings about these different authors and their works. And last of all, Jane Austen. Here's his quote about her. Her books have only two faults, and both are damnable. They are too few and too short. End quote. All right, a few quotes just to close out this section. So the reason for fairy tales, let's read about that first. On that side as author, I wrote fairy tales because the fairy tale seemed the ideal form for the stuff I had to say. Succinct, I like it. It's a good reason. Now, the next part, let me read, this is one paragraph. All right. It would be truer to say that the fairyland arouses a longing for he knows not what. It stirs and troubles him to his lifelong enrichment, with the dim sense of something beyond his reach, and far from dulling the emptying the actual world, gives it a new dimension and depth. He does not despise real woods because he has read of enchanted woods. The reading makes all real woods a little enchanted. This is a special kind of longing. The boy reading the school story of the type I have in mind desires success and is unhappy once the book is over because he can't get it. The boy reading the fairy tale desires and is happy in the very fact of desiring, for his mind has not been concentrated on himself as it often is in the more realistic story. End quote. I love that. I mean, that is so well said. And just how fairy stories, they can elicit this desire, this longing that stories, more realistic stories, can never reach. And he's talking about this in the sense of what do we give kids to read? And I love that came out. And he talks later about this parental fear of or parental desire not to scare children with certain stories. And he says, look, when I was a kid, I had night tremors, I had fears. So I'm not trying to dismiss this, but what Lewis says is none of my fears came from fairy tales. And he just kind of goes through some of the fears that he has. And then he goes and he says, none of those came from fairy tales. So there's great value in having children read these books and not to keep them from a worry that they're going to be scared. The fears that he had as a child and the fears that he saw in other children, they were not from these fairy stories. They were from other things. Last up, he says, you have not read a book if you've only read it once. And this busted me pretty good because I'm sitting here, I'm trying to go through the great books and I'm just reading them once. And here's what he says about that. An unliterary man may be defined as one who reads books only once. There is hope for a man who has never read Malory or Boswell or Tristram Shandy or Shakespeare's sonnets. But what can you do with a man who says he has read them, meaning that he has read them once and thinks that settles the matter? For excitement, it is just what must disappear from a second reading. You cannot, except at the first reading, be really curious about what happened. If you find that the reader of a popular romance, however uneducated a reader, however bad the romance is, goes back to his old favorites again and again, then you have pretty good evidence that they are to him a sort of poetry. The rereader is looking not for actual surprises, which can only come once, but for certain surprisingness. The point has often been misunderstood. We do not enjoy a story fully at the first reading. Not to the curiosity, the sheer narrative lust has been given its sop and laid asleep. Are we at leisure to savor the real beauties? Till then, it is like wasting great wine on a ravenous natural thirst, which merely wants cold wetness. The children understand this well when they ask for the same story over and over again, and in the same words. They want again to have that surprise of discovering what seemed Little Red Riding Hood's grandmother is really the wolf. Is it better when you know it is coming? Free from the shock of actual surprise, you can attend better to the intrinsic surprisingness of the plot structure. End quote. Sorry for the long quote, but that was so good. That was so helpful. And just that it's good to read stories twice. I love that he points that out in children. The children, they love that. They understand this idea. They keep asking for the same story over and over again. Why are they doing that? They know the story, but there can be deeper things that come about these rereadings. Closing out here with the reading stats. This is how long it took. It's a 189-page book. It's a small book, so there's not a whole lot of words on each page. It took me 2 hours and 45 minutes to read it. That was over 2 days. So I did 95 pages per day. It was a pretty quick read. That was July 8 and 9 of 2023. All right, I'm just going to close out in the next segment just by tying together these two books and the ideas therein. Well, these two books were a neat pair to read back to back. Bookstores don't exist without authors, and authors, while they don't need a bookstore to write a book, it sure helps in the selling of books. So there's this natural connection between the Praise of Good Bookstores and on writing and kind of the author side of it. But there's a third element involved as well, and that is the connection point between the author and the bookstore, and that is the reader. The reader must be given the chance to discover. And so my one thing was that comment by Jeff Deutsch about algorithms reinforcing who you were in the past, whereas browsing allows you to be given the chance to discover and to become someone new in a way. That when you're browsing, you come across things. There's a serendipity to it that is there in a way with the algorithms, but not as much as when you're browsing in a bookstore. I love watching when people are in Landmark and just seeing what they're doing and where they're going and where they're browsing, where do they gravitate and where do you gravitate when you go in? If you like a certain author, who influenced that author? Could you also be influenced by the books that author was influenced by, or the authors that author was influenced by? If you just read a book about, say, Egypt, did you know that there are books about Egyptian art that might just blow your mind, that might help you capture some of the ideas that you just read about Egypt and see how they were displayed in art? Did you know that St. Augustine's Confessions were based upon the structure of the Odyssey? Well, what if you read both of those books back to back? And this is just some of the discovery, some of the serendipity that happens when you're going through a bookstore. Books come from books. And so there's this entire library that you can go in, and maybe you haven't seen one, you haven't been in one since you were in school, but bookstores allow that experience to be in a number of different places. So this episode is a call to take that time in bookstores instead of trusting the algorithms. And if you like this, then you like that. That's basically what an algorithm is showing you. And again, that's going to be pointing to the past. But what happens in a bookstore when you spend some time, when you get lost and you browse, that's where the gold is. And that's where you can be looking forward of what direction you want to go. Just a reminder here too, that I'm not just talking about Amazon in the sense of algorithms saying, if you liked this, you'll like that. I'm talking about social media as well. And that is based around an algorithm. And so every time you like something, you click that like button, you're pigeonholing yourself more and more. You're just going to start being shown more and more what you like. But again, just remember that's pointing to the past. That's what you liked in the past. Even if it was just a minute ago, that was the past. But what about moving forward? Just keep that in mind. So this is not just about bookstores. It's a larger point, just to set aside time for this serendipity, this browsing, this being aware, and for growing and becoming rather than only being shown things that you liked in the past. Oh, and do not forget this. Please start kissing your books. All right, that's going to do it for this episode. Thank you for listening. I would love to hear from you if you've read either of these two books. Maybe you've been to the Seminary Co-op bookstore in Chicago that Jeff Deutsch, the author of the first book here, where he works. I'd love to hear your stories. I'd love to hear what you thought of these two books if you've read them. Or if C.S. Lewis is a favorite of yours, let's reminisce. Send me a note at eric@booksoftitans.com. That is Eric with a K, so ERIK at booksoftitans.com. And share. I'd love to hear your thoughts. I love when people email me after listening, and that's one of the reasons I started this project, is to get in touch with other people who have enjoyed some of the same books that I have. You can follow Books of Titans on Instagram or Twitter, and the website is stock full of resources to help you find the best books and to create your own reading list. I also have my great books list there, so you can see what order I'll be reading them in, and I am calling it the Great Books Plus. So it's the great work, but then also a book that helps me to better understand either the author or the context, cultural context in which that work was written. Also, a lot of these great books are just hard. They're difficult, and so I need help just kind of understanding what's in them. So that's the purpose of these guidebooks, the Great Books Plus. So I'll be back in a week or two to discuss another book or from my 2023 reading list. And until then, keep reading, keep learning, and keep listening. I am out.